Now, there's a certain truth to it. Actually, I mean, the Sinhala show in the Sinhala racism, Sinhala Buddhist chauvinism is actually, the thing is, what we know as Sinhala Buddhist nationalism now is actually a colonial construct. It was constructed by the colonial masters. I mean, this hybrid identity, bringing the religious component into ethnic component and fusing them together, was actually done by the colonial masters. This was done in the 19th century. And before that, the Sinhala Buddhist identity, and that what I mean is that hybrid identity was not a kind of decisive or defining factor in the way the Sinhala or generally the people think. The people were, I mean, that's why many of the social scientists have pointed out the Sinhalese in the past, before the colonial intervention, there was a religious consciousness. People wanted the king to be a Buddhist, but the ethnic consciousness was not that strong. That's why the last 176 years, the so-called Sinhala kingdom or the Kandyan kingdom was ruled by 4 kings imported from India, Nayakar kings. They were basically imported from India to rule the last kingdom. And the people didn't have an issue with them as long as they presented themselves as Buddhist kings. So what existed at that time was actually a religious consciousness and not a ethno-religious consciousness. And this ethno-religious consciousness, which is the Sinhala Buddhist consciousness, and the ideology based on that consciousness, which is the Sinhala Buddhist nationalism, was constructed, invented, I would say, by the British colonial powers. And they are the ones who actually, in the 19th century, basically in 3 fields. One is archaeology, one is historiography, and the other one is anthropology. Now, using these fields, they constructed an identity for the Sinhalese. And the reason is they were the ones who actually constructed the unitary state of Sri Lanka. In 1832, it was they who basically amalgamated or kind of, joined all the remaining areas into one political center. And it was done by the British. And when they created the unitary state, what we know as the unitary state of Sri Lanka, there was a problem how people who lived in different kingdoms, who lived in different parts without knowing actually, I am a citizen of this particular unitary state. Now the British had a problem how to convince them that this is their state. And the way to do that is to invent a new ethno-religious nationalism that basically made the state natural, made for the people who lived in that state, it was made natural by this ideology. And the Sinhalese started thinking, this is the unitary state which had been there for 2,500 years, which is complete, utter nonsense. Because if you look at the written history, Sri Lanka has never been anything close to a unitary state longer than 200 years. So almost like 2,300 years, Sri Lanka was ruled as different kingdoms. The island of Sri Lanka was basically ruled as different kingdoms. So the reason is this actually. The reason British colonized Sri Lanka, as I said earlier, was not because they saw anything inside the country, but because they saw Sri Lanka is located close to India, which is considered as the jewel in the crown, the most important colony of the entire British Empire. And Sri Lanka was seen as the most ideal strategic post that can be used to control India. So they wanted to have a grip on the strategic post. And they wanted to make sure the people who live in this strategic post would not rebel against the British Empire. They would not join hands with the Indian independence struggle and create an alliance, a broader alliance in the Indian subcontinent to fight against the British imperialism. So what they did basically was to make sure that could not happen. They created a consciousness for the Sinhalese, and based on that consciousness, they created nationalism. That's why I said the Sinhala Buddhist nationalism is not post-colonial. it is colonial. It's a colonial construction. In other countries, you may find nationalisms which are considered as post-colonial ideologies. But in Sri Lanka, the British colonial master, they created this ideology for us. They made it us, I mean, basically us, when I say us, I mean Sinhalese, they made that to internalize. And the problem is, which may be a little bit controversial when I say this, the problem is, even the Sinhala left, I would always emphasize the fact that we had a left, but it was a Sinhala left with Tamil members. We had a Sinhala left with Tamil and Muslim members, but ideologically, it was a Sinhala left. Why do I say so? The reason is actually, the left had been, in the real sense of the word, if it had been a Sri Lankan left, 1 million plantation workers would not have been sent to India in such easy manner. Such easily they couldn't have done that. And if you look at for example, the first left-wing party, the LSSP, if you look at their party program in 1939, and all the points, if you go through all the points, despite the fact that it was the plantation workers who actually contributed immensely to maintain the massive welfare state. Massive welfare state was actually maintained by the plantation workers. They were the ones who actually produced the surplus. And that surplus was used to maintain that welfare state. That welfare state, for example, our welfare state, we got free education, we got free healthcare, and that was given not after the colonial masters left, but actually we got it while the colonial masters were ruling us. And that was possible because it was the plantation workers who produced the surplus. But when they were sent back to India, there was no general strikes called. Nobody wanted to call a general strike against that decision. And in the party program in 1939, the action kind of program which the LSSP put forward, there was not a single point that deals with the issue of the plantation workers, not a single point. And LSSP is the party that always we consider at least had a position on the Sinhala Only Act, the LSSP and the Communist Party. But 1939, it was only LSSP because the Communist Party was not formed by then. But there was no mentioning about the plantation workers and how they basically accommodated the demands of the plantation workers into their party program. There was a mentioning about the youth, about women, about the peasants, about urban workers, but not about plantation workers. How could that happen? That can only happen because it was a Sinhala left. So in that sense, I think Anagaka Dhanapala's role was a kind of a cultural, I mean, he was not an anti-colonial warrior or anything. He was someone who benefited out of, he come from a family which benefited out of colonial economy, which basically earned profits from colonial economy. And therefore, I think Sinhala nationalism, Sinhala Buddhist nationalism, one last thing I wanted to say is that there's a contradiction, because Sinhala Buddhist nationalism is now, people understand, as something that is against the Western imperial intervention into Sri Lanka. Normally the Sinhalese believe we are Sinhala Buddhist nationalists and we oppose any kind of Western intervention. But the irony is actually this very ideology, the Sinhala Buddhist nationalism, was a Western creation. It was a colonial creation. It was created by them. It was created by an external force and made a people to internalize it, made them to internalize it, to feel that it is ours. And this is the people who didn't have any problem with 4 Tamil kings who ruled the last kingdom for the last 176 years, who didn't have any problem with the ethnic identity of those kings. But within the next 100 years, we started to basically believe that this country exclusively belongs to the Sinhala Buddhist people. And whoever that lives in this island basically live according to the wishes of the Sinhala Buddhist people. And that is a kind of a victory for the colonial powers. And one last thing I wanted to add, is actually the reason they did it. Now, normally we believe there was this divide and rule the British did everywhere. So they basically divided Sinhalese and the Tamils, and because it was convenient for them to rule both. But actually, the real thing is actually, my opinion, the Sinhala and Tamil, that the British were interested not simply to divide the Sinhalese from the Tamils, but they wanted to divide Sri Lanka from India. When I say divide, I know that it's two different countries. They are geographically close to each other, but they wanted to make sure especially after, there were polygar uprising and all these things in the 18th century, and in the 19th century with the Sepoy mutiny in 1957. So there was a kind of growing independence struggle inside India. And the British wanted to make sure the Sri Lanka will not get dragged into or to absorbed into this anti-imperial, anti-empire, the anti-colonial struggle that was raging across India. So in order to do that, they created basically a history, convinced the Sinhalese, India, whatever that comes from India, is actually hostile to Sri Lanka civilization. Especially the southern Indian kind of invasions have destroyed the golden civilizations the Sinhalese built. So they wanted to make sure the Sinhalese would not get connected to the Tamils and through them to the Indians. And what they did was they created a history and convinced the Sinhalese, you are special. Your civilization is so special. And you are more close to us than any of the people who are living close to you. You are more close to us means to the white people. Your civilization is quite close to the Greek civilization. And therefore, that civilization was not destroyed by us. That was destroyed by the Indian invasions, the South Indian, the Pandya, Kerala, all these invasions. They are the ones who destroyed it. So as a result of it, because they wanted to keep Sri Lanka away from getting absorbed into anti-British colonial struggle, they convinced the Sinhalese that they have been the historical enemy. The historical enemy of the Sinhala civilization were actually the invaders who came from India. And as a result of it, we didn't get absorbed into Indian independence struggle, even though there was a live link which came from the Jaffna Youth League, for example, who were still working closely with the Indian National Congress at that time. But that connection was never made, just as British wanted it to happen. And as a result, we got the first British colony to get adult voting right. So adult voting rights, Sri Lanka became the first colony in the entire British Empire to get adult voting rights just 3 years after the British got it. We were the first black people who started voting. We were the first black people in the the British Empire who got the right to vote. Not because we fought for that, because they decided they should give it to us. And as a result of that, we thought Tamils are the minority, Muslims are the minority, and we are the majority because we started counting votes. So this is a different interpretation of history, which is not directly connected to the question you asked, but at the same time, there's a connection as well. So the connection is the Sinhala Buddhist racism is actually constructed by the British. And to a certain extent, it was endorsed by political actors from right to left. From right to left, actually. And that's why we see there was no voice in the entire South. There were exceptional kind of voices. I'm not saying individuals are not there, but as a powerful political force, there was no voice when these genocidal massacres were happening. And that's because we are connected, our existence is connected to the survival of the state. And we all, in one or another way, legitimize the existence of the state, the Sinhala Buddhist centric state. Some people openly say it, some don't say it. So there's a covert support and there's overt support. So that's basically what I think.